Thank you, Senator McLucas. Senator Fawcett.
Thank you, Mr President. I too rise to address the Veterans Affairs Legislation Amendment 2015 Budgetary Measures Bill. This bill gives effect to a number of Veterans Affairs measures that the government promised in the 2015 budget, and it builds on the support that the Coalition has had for Veterans Affairs, both during the Howard government, during the period in opposition, and as we have come into government. As I said in my maiden speech coming into this place, having spent over 2 decades in the ADF, I believe it's important that loyalty flows both ways. We expect loyalty from our servicemen to the government of the day, whichever side owes a loyalty back to those people who have served this nation and to their families. And it is good to see a largely bipartisan approach to this bill to make sure that measures are at least incrementally, if not in one fell swoop, improved for the veterans community. And I just want to acknowledge the many people from the various ESOs who are consistent in their advocacy for veterans and their families, whether they be the TPI Association, Defence Welfare, RSL, Vietnam Veterans, through to Men's Sheds organisation, Barry Heffernan in South Australia, advocating on behalf of people who've been abused in defence. There are many people who invest a lot of their time and effort, and I just want to acknowledge at the start of this bill that many of the measures that are brought forward by the Parliament of Australia are as a result of the hard work and passion of people who care deeply for our service and ex-service community. So this budget for this year made an investment of more than $12 billion in services for veterans and their families, which has a significant focus on bringing intervention earlier. So early intervention has been proven time and again to have good outcomes, and so I'll be talking about a number of the measures with that. The other thing that it has done is it's expanded case coordination or case management, particularly for complex cases, and having just sat through last week a couple of days of hearings with the Senate Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade References Committee, looking at mental health concerns for serving men and women, and naturally that also looked at those in transition as well as many veterans. What became very apparent was that it is a complex system. That alone is something we need to be continuing to try and improve. But that because of the complexity of the system, some individuals have had dreadful experiences, and I would say largely in the past, although clearly that is not uniquely true, with both Defence and DVA. But one of the things that became very clear was that those who have had good experiences with DVA, and particularly in recent times, are the ones where there has been a case manager appointed, and there has been someone who has taken a greater deal of responsibility within the system to make sure that each element of that veteran's care is coordinated and followed up so that that person actually receives timely responses and considered responses, rather than having to deal with countless different people within the DVA system, countless different groups, having to repeat their story, finding case files that are lost or delayed or sent interstate. Obviously, the appointment of case coordinators makes a significant difference, and I'm pleased that the budget measures from 2015 have increased investment in that. I would like to see us get to the point where the appointment of a case manager is best practice and applied for all people who are dealing with DVA. Obviously, the simpler cases, it will be a low workload for the case manager, but for those who need it, and certainly for those people who come to DVA, they and their families often at a crisis point when either anxiety or depression or PTSD or some other issue has brought them to the point where they realise that they need help. The last thing they need is for an administrative system that doesn't gather all the bits together and support them through the process. One of the most significant things to help people in that area is advocacy, and so before I go on to the remainder of the actual bill, I just want to highlight the context of some of these other budget measures and the difference that has made. Again, during this hearing, we heard that many people would not have made progress through the DVA system at all or effectively, and we heard of a number of people who had claims rejected or the process slowed up because they hadn't filled in forms properly, and so clearly well-trained and resourced advocates are an essential part of the system to support veterans and their families. And it was good to see in this budget the restoration of $1 million per annum in the BEST program, the Building Excellence and Support and Training program, which supports advocacy and welfare work. The budget's also, as I said, prioritised early intervention, which is important, as well as expanding the services provided by the Veterans and Veterans Families Counselling Service. We heard countless testimony from serving members and particularly veterans and their families about VVCS and the great work that they do. One of the consistent messages was, though, that many people were unaware that they were eligible for the service or what the service could provide, and there was a deal of discussion on both of the days of last week's hearings around how we could make sure that veterans, and more to the point, veterans' families or the families of serving members could be made aware of the services that are available to them. So I'm pleased to see again, as part of this year's budget measures, that there is a dedicated website and a Facebook page for the VVCS, an expansion of their e-health services for veterans and service providers. There's also a broadening of DVA's reach on social media through dedicated YouTube channels, dedicated Facebook pages, including short videos, focusing on the services provided by DVA to their families. So a number of measures, even down to as basic as writing to people when they discharge to advise them of the services and support that is available from DVA. Because this communication is critical. There's no point having all the services in the world if the people who need them are not aware that they are there. So these measures are very welcome. The work also with the Australian College of General Practitioners to improve materials that support GPs to identify service-related issues so that through that initial point of contact in the primary healthcare system, which is often the GP, wherever possible, we do actually identify the fact that this individual has served their nation and therefore they can be either referred to DVA or VVCS, but also we can help link them in with those systems through having GPs act as that first point of referral. Another significant investment is improving the access for mental health conditions such as PTSD and anxiety and depression, so that without having to actually lodge a claim and demonstrate an award of compensation, that somebody can access the treatment they need immediately. We heard some dreadful stories of people, particularly going to the past, who had their conditions exacerbated by the fact that they had to fight a battle just to even access treatment, let alone compensation. And so the investment that has occurred to streamline that process so that anyone on presentation with those issues can get treatment is welcome. What we need to be seeing is an increase in capacity, because clearly, as we have more people serving, impacting on greater numbers of families and reservists' families, the demand on that system will just grow. And so it's important to make sure that the capacity is there within VVCS or others to be able to support people. Finally, the pilot of the Veterans Employment Rehabilitation Program is important as a pathway to help people get back into work, and that relates a little bit to the topic of this bill, which we'll get onto. And finally, cutting red tape, making it easier for veterans to prove their identity when making a claim with DVA, are all measures coming out of the budget which are welcome for our veterans and service members, particularly those in transition. This bill has a number of measures. The first will benefit veterans through the enhancements to the Veterans Vocational Rehabilitation Scheme under the Veterans Entitlements Act. This is a voluntary scheme which is designed to assist veterans to find or to continue in suitable employment, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. The enhancements to the scheme will expand the range of services, including medical management and psychological services, and it will also have an impact on the thresholds for special and intermediate rate disability pensioners, having a smoother step down so that it is more there's more advantage to somebody actually choosing to work. And what we've seen, and again in the last week heard people give testimony, that the ability to get back into the workforce without having to worry about what's going to happen to your support pension, particularly if you have to withdraw from the workforce later, is a huge benefit to both the individual veteran and their families. So anything we can do to make that better is welcome. We'll also be looking at streamlining the appeal process under the Military Rehabilitation and Compensation Act, and I'll talk about that later. Finally, the bill amends the Defence Act to make the repatriation of the remains of service dependents buried in the Teradek military cemetery in Malaysia, if requested by the families of the deceased. We can bring those people and service them back to Australia. And that's because of the unique situation here, where that base is a high security base, similar to our bases here, where access by dependents and the public is not easy. And the Malaysian government have generously worked and agreed to cooperate with Australia to allow that repatriation should the families so wish. The Schedule 1 of this bill looks particularly at the Veterans Vocational Rehabilitation Scheme, and rehabilitation is provided under Part 6A of the Veterans Entitlements Act, and what it basically sets up is a situation where people who participate in this voluntary scheme, the VVRS, who withdraw from the workforce for any reason, will return to the rate of disability pension they received prior to their participation in the VVRS. One of the great concerns that has been raised with me time and again is people say, look, we'd be happy to get into work, but we don't want to go through the battle again to re-establish our eligibility for that support. And so you have this awful dilemma where people who would like to work and perhaps capable of doing more work see the nightmare of the battle that they had as such a barrier that they don't want to take the risk of having to repeat that. So this scheme provides an opportunity for people to say, look, I'd like to participate in it, I'd like to work, but I know I've got the safety net there that if I do have to withdraw, either because I'm not managing or even because I just retire, then I can go back to it. One of the things we've had in the past to encourage participation is that recipients of the Special Intermediate Rate Disability Pension can undertake work beyond the thresholds of 8 hours or 20 hours per week without losing the entitlement to that disability pension and associated benefits. But the step down in terms of over time, the amount of pension that they do start to lose, it's been tapered. So after a period of time, over a 7-year period, it eventually would come back to 100% of the general rate. What we're doing now is trying to simplify that process and so make it more attractive for people to work, so that as they work, the default position that they come back to, those on a special rate, as they exceed the threshold in terms of the number of hours worked and that income is no longer exempt, rather than having to apply for intermediate rate, they automatically go to that rate while they're continuing to work above that threshold. And what that means is there's less red tape, it's a smoother process. They end up with that safety net still, that should they then have to come back under the threshold or indeed give up work altogether, they will still come back to the full payment that they were on previously. The other enhancements that we're looking at to the VVRS is to expand the range of services available to include the provision of medical management and psychological or psychosocial services. So the medical management involves the monitoring and the treatment measures to restore or maximise a person's physical and psychological function. This is important because whether it's pain management, whether it's disability counselling or even family education, these are all factors that help in the process of rehabilitation, actually trying to get people back on their feet, trying to get them into the workforce, not so that they're not a burden on the government. Some people see this as a cynical effort to say, you know, we just want you back working, but the proven evidence and the evidence we received from veterans and their families is when people are capable of work and they work, it is better for them, for their own self-esteem, for their own psychological well-being, and it's better for their family. And this is about trying to make that process easier while still keeping that important safety net in place and wrapping those additional services around them. The second measure that the opposition has expressed some concern over is the review or the appeal process. I'd just like to step back to the fact that under the former government there was a review of MERCA which was conducted in 2012 and one of the recommendations of that was this streamlining of this appeal process, and that recommendation was accepted by the former government, which then triggered the consultation. And I give them full credit for that. It was a comprehensive consultation with ESOs to say this is the recommendation the review has come up with. What is your view of that? And all of the major ESOs that were consulted in the 2012-13 period came back and said they supported this approach in terms of streamlining and just having the one process rather than the parallel option before people actually went to the AAT. So the government's position is that there has been an inquiry into MERCA, there has been consultation with ESOs, and the strong support of those organisations would indicate that the recommended path, the path that is now captured in this legislation, is the path that we should be moving forward on. So I would certainly encourage senators here to support the recommendation because it has actually been subject of an inquiry, it's been subject of consultation. If there are issues that arise with it, I see no reason, given the strong bipartisan approach we have around Veterans Affairs, why it couldn't be revisited if issues emerged, but I see no point in delaying the implementation of something that's been recommended from a review, has been supported by consultation by ESO groups. I think that would make sense. Because certainly the delay is a real issue. Again, in the inquiry we had last week, we heard a number of people talk about just the debilitating impact that delays in assessments and appeals had. And whilst I know it's been raised and both sides of politics in the past have pushed back on the idea of having set timeframes for assessing a claim before the default position is that it's awarded in favour of the veteran, my understanding is that other comparable nations, I believe such as the UK, have a system where there is a time frame. And if there's going to be an inquiry of any kind, I would actually say that would be a good topic to have an inquiry into, to see how that could work, what the benefits are, what the downsides are, because my sense is that that would remove a significant cause of frustration, anxiety and additional harm that occurs to veterans if we had that time frame that had to be complied with, or it would default to the veteran's favour. Which would allow people to move on, allow the process to move through stage to stage, whether that was to an appeal or whether that was continue on with both rehabilitation treatment and the compensation if appropriate. Mr Acting Deputy President, I do support the measures in this bill. They give effect to a number of the long-term commitments of this government, which have not only been in our policy that we took to the election, but importantly, it's been through the budget measures that have been brought down. So whether it's the expansion of the programs, the streamlining and removing of red tape, it's an example of us incrementally moving to that point where the loyalty is flowing both ways, both from the service to the government
Thank you,
and the
Senator
government
Fawcett.
to the services.
Your time's expired. Senator Lamb.